Stanford University.
Welcome. Welcome to Stanford Medicine's Contemplation by Design Summit. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, the founder and director of Contemplation by Design. It is my great honor to introduce Diane Musho Hamilton, who will be speaking to us today about sameness and difference. Diane Musho Hamilton is a Zen teacher, author, professional mediator, and facilitator. She has been a practitioner of meditation for more than 35 years. Diane began her studies at Naropa University in 1983 with Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche and became a Zen student of Genpo Dennis Merzel Roshi in 1997. In 2003, she received ordination as a Zen monk and received Dharma transmission in 2006. Diane facilitates Big Mind, Big Heart, a process developed by Genpo Roshi to help elicit the insights of Zen in Western audiences. She has worked with Ken Wilber and the Integral Institute since 2004. As the director of the Office of Alternative Dispute Resolution for the Utah Judiciary, Diane established mediation programs throughout the court system and won several prestigious awards for her work in this area. Diane lives in Utah, where she is the executive director of Two Arrows Zen, a center for Zen study and practice established in 2008 with her husband, Michael Zimmerman. She is the author of Everything is Workable, a Zen approach to conflict resolution, and also The Zen of You and Me, a guide to getting along with just about anyone. Her most recent book, co-authored with Gabriel Wilson and Kimberly Lowe, is titled Compassionate Conversations, How to Speak and Listen from the Heart. She is also a contributor to The Hidden Lamp, Stories from 25 Centuries of Awakened Women, and The Dharma of Dogs, Our Best Friends as Spiritual Teachers. We warmly welcome Diane. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rich. It's just a pleasure. Thank you for having me. I am very honored to be here, and I hope that what I have to share is of value to those of you who've made time to come to this session today. So I understand that the Contemplation by Design Summit has been spent a lot of time looking at the body and also at how we work with trauma, the way that it's held in the body, and also generally the fight or flight system, our defensive patterning, so that in a way you could say that a lot of the work that we're doing as contemplatives, as meditators, as people who are just generally committed to becoming more aware, right now there's a tremendous amount of our attention that's being paid to well-being and to human resilience and how to actually work with some of the neurophysiology in our body in order to help us become the kind of awake, kind, and available human beings that we want to be. So as Dr. Rich mentioned, I am both a meditator for many, many years. I like to say that and I'm also a mediator by profession. I used to be the director of dispute resolution for the state of Utah. And over the last 10 years have also worked in the area of human transformation and human development with the Integral Institute. So I'm a mediator and I'm a meditator. And it's taken me until probably 10 years ago to realize that fundamentally they're the same thing. You know, when we meditate, we literally bring our attention into the here and now so that our body, our breath, our mind, and the expanse of our environment become one. And then we practice just learning to stay present and available to things as they are. This practice of sitting still, of being awake, is really a practice in discovering our fundamental sameness, if you will. And as a mediator, it turns out that it's very much the same thing, where as a mediator, I'll work with a group of people who, for whatever reason, disagree, or maybe they're having a particular kind of conflict, or maybe they're having a contract dispute. But for whatever reason, what's front and center in their awareness is not the way in which they're the same, but the way in which they're different. And when we have the experience of being different, and that difference can very easily become a valuation of one person's good and one person's bad, or we're in the right and they're in the wrong. And it can also become quite threatening to the status quo, that the way we work with difference has everything to do with discovering the underlying commonality. Not, we can create it, but usually it's there. We're just not seeing it. So mediation and meditation really have a lot to do with deepening our experience of our, you could say, our inherent unity, and then using differences as a way for us to grow, because the universe evolves through this kind of alteration between sameness and difference. I had one time a neuroscientist who was in a workshop with me and said that basically our brain evolves through, there's high coherence in the neural pathways. We have an experience or a set of learnings, new neural pathways are created. Those neural pathways are integrated into the brain, so they become more and more and more the same. So it's the same, there's difference that emerges, and that difference gets integrated. And that's really how it is we grow. In other words, we don't grow as human beings without encountering differences, but differences are much more challenging to our nervous system than encountering and discovering sameness, which for the most part feels really good to us. So there was a Zen master who once said that the mind of unity is easy to attain. It's the mind of a difference that's difficult to accomplish. And I think what he really has in mind when he says that is that it is such a relaxing experience to discover our belonging. It feels so good to our nervous system to walk into a group of people who look like we do, who dress like we do, who think the same way, speak the same language. It's very, there's a sense that all of a sudden we can let down. We know that in our evolutionary history that the encounter with people who were different than we were was very easily threatening, and that we were more likely in some ways to be hurt through that encounter, and belonging to our tribe or our collective is what provided safety for us. So sameness is the source of this really profound safety. There was a study done at Google, and this was I would say about 3 years ago, that the results of this came out. And basically what they said is they were looking at their most effective, but also you could say satisfied, or teams that demonstrated a lot of well-being, so they could execute, but they also felt good about what was happening. And one of the commonalities in their teams were that there was just an abundance of psychological safety. People felt that when they went to work in the team, that they basically were free to relax, they were free to disclose, they could express their mistakes, they could take risks, there were good giving and receiving feedback loops, all of that because there was some fundamental sense that they were for each other, that they belonged together, and that they would support each other. So sameness is a really, really profound experience. Sometimes it's so close to us that we really literally take it for granted, because difference catches our attention. It excites us, it wakes us up, and sameness in a certain way allows us to let down. So I notice right now, for instance, in culture generally, that there can be, it's not the case everywhere, but I do notice that we tend to skip over often the skills and the practices that bring us into deeper experiences of sameness. Because in a certain way, that's obvious, that's easy. We're very attracted and focused on our differences right now. But without deeper levels of sameness, of bonding, of trust, of belonging, it's very difficult to explore our differences in a way that's optimal. So the depth of our trust, as in these teams, actually creates the opportunity for us to learn more explicitly, and you could say energetically, from our differences. Now, there are all kinds of implications of this. I'm speaking mainly in the interpersonal realm, because our differences add up in ways in culture, as we know, where they become the us and them, the differences between groups, the history of oppression, the tendency towards holy wars. The very profound us and them is a difference in culture and in our systems that can create tremendous injustice. And that's something that we really have to work on. And there are different approaches for doing that. But being aware of the power of invoking and deepening our commonality, and then being able to heighten, explore, and work with our differences, even though they can feel threatening. And if our differences take on the tone of conflict, they can actually feel, we can lapse into our conflict style. Some of us are very good at avoiding conflict. Others of us want to accommodate and get along. Others of us are competitive and will lean into the conflict. So when difference becomes conflict, it becomes an embodied exercise at that point. And that's part of what I want us to really explore today, is how can we work with our bodies in a way that when there's a difference, we can, in a way you could say, move counterintuitively toward the conflict, because we can see it for what it is and we can actually work with our own body. So I'll get to that in just a minute. The last thing I want to say about sameness is that our deepest spiritual insight is really a glimpse into our sameness. In my tradition, I study in the Zen tradition, there is a story of the Buddha's enlightenment. And basically, the Buddha had been on a very extensive spiritual search for about 6 years. And there was a point at which he was looking for a quality of mind that was unconditioned, that was utterly reliable, in which the body and mind became completely peaceful. And in order for that to occur, in a way, the experience of difference is relaxed, and one opens to whatever is arising, and without judgment and without a need for things to be different, there's a sense of a deepening and a coherence and a kind of coming into, a quality of unity. And in the Buddha's enlightenment experience, what he said was, he touched the ground and he said, "When I awakened, the great earth and all beings awakened." And in that expression is the sense that we are, by our very nature, deeply at home where we are. And that when we're awake and when we're available to what is, and when we trust that we belong fundamentally, that we're not separate from others and we're not separate from any life forms. And the wisdom that really comes from that is life-changing. For any of us who've really cultivated a spiritual practice or a meditative practice and had that deep sense that even though, as one jazz player said, the world is all messed up, it's utterly cool. Everything is okay. Everything is okay as it is. And there's a deep recognition that feeling that level of peace and serenity is actually our birthright. It's actually the case that we are fundamentally at home where we are. So cultivating sameness, whether it's in our body, whether it's in the interpersonal domain, or whether it's literally this quality of universality, is really an important skill to have. It's one that you can use in your family, you can use in your teams, you can use when you're doing systems change work. How is it that we can bring about an experience of our fundamental continuity, of our deep regard for the sameness of our existential challenges of being human, and that we're deeply the same in our aspiration and what it is we want, which is fundamentally to be happy and for the world to be fair. Now we can talk about, there might be some outliers on that, but when people are clear, that's really the case. So we'll talk a little bit after a meditation about one of the skills that we can use to create sameness, that you can use in your life. So, as I said, spiritual practice, whether it's meditation or prayer or reading sacred texts or singing together, fundamentally, we're discovering the identity that is beyond the personal and separate self. And now when we move into the domain of difference, we're working with a whole different set of feelings. And that's one of the main things that I want to convey to you. And this really comes home to me as a mediator, because when I walk into a room of people who are struggling with one another, it doesn't feel good. I notice my senses awaken. I notice my nervous system start to drip adrenaline and cortisol. I can feel the increase in my heart rate. I feel some nausea in my stomach. Sometimes I can feel some clenching in my neck. Nothing's going on. I just walk into a room where people are not getting along, and my entire physiology changes, as does yours. One of my messages to you today is that you are a very sensitive human being, and that what happens with this incredible, let's call it a, danger detector that's, hundreds of thousands of years old, is that it processes super quickly. Your body picks up the experience of difference as exciting, and potentially, there's growth, there's possibility, but it very quickly can become stressful. If you can't find enough commonality, it becomes stressful, and then it becomes threatening. And when it becomes threatening, this is really important for everyone to understand, when those sensations build up in the body and our defensive systems start to be activated, we actually are not able to learn. So this is really, really important for you to understand. And I would actually like to read just one page to you. This is from the last book that I wrote, Compassionate Conversations with Gabe Wilson and Kimberly Lowe. And I'm just going to read this section where we describe some of kind of what happens in the body when we start to experience difference that is interpreted as threat. Okay. And even as I am speaking about difference, I would really invite you to just notice if by chance, when I switch topics, if you didn't notice your physiology change a little bit. Even when I was speaking about sameness, you could feel some relaxation set in. And when I moved into talking about difference, there's more excitement, there's a little more wakefulness, and maybe even a little bit of unease. So check that out while I read this. So talking about our differences makes a lot of people uncomfortable, particularly if it means revealing our private prejudices or looking at injustices in society or talking about the ways in which we disagree. Most of us just don't want to do it. It isn't that we're not interested, it's that it creates real challenges in the experience in our body. Like a finely tuned radar system, our nervous system picks up on the tiniest differences and responds in high contrast to how it does when we encounter familiarity and sameness. Surprising as it may be, just discussing our differences can feel threatening. It depends on how much rapport and how much safety there is in a relationship and how much practice one has, but it can very easily become elevated and a little bit difficult to stay present in one's body. So even conversations about differences can provoke a fight or flight response. And instead of feeling that relaxation that we've been describing, the rush of adrenaline and other stress hormones pervade the body, increasing our heart rate, flushing the skin, like mine is, tightening our jaws and shoulder muscles, activating our limbs, introducing trembling, sensations of nausea in the stomach or the solar plexus. And these are uncomfortable. Sometimes people cry when they have this kind of experience if they're not able to move. There can be aggression or defensiveness in our voice. It's difficult to listen when there are stress hormones present in the body. Access to the prefrontal cortex is impeded, making it almost impossible to think clearly or to hold multiple perspectives. When our nervous system's activated, we're in a conversation with our partner. Our partner just happens to have a different view, and literally we can't find a way to consider it. Not because we don't want to, but because there's a way that our these age-old systems are actually narrowing our focus so that we can act. So when that's happening, it's very difficult to open to a bigger perspective. I'm hoping this makes sense to you. So memory is affected too. Sometimes we literally can't remember that we like someone, if we start feeling defensive. And the evolutionary purpose of this is to provide a boost of energy for movement, for a quick defensive response, and for protection. Usually when we feel triggered in our system, our first impulse is to move away or defend. So the triggering of this defensive response is one reason that we often don't have very much success when we're under its influence. Even though we maybe appear to communicating, what we're really doing is coping with the uncomfortable sensation of stress in the body. So as a facilitator and a mediator, when I train and work with people, we do a lot of embodiment work, because when a group starts to feel stressed together, they cease being as productive. They cease being able to learn. So I will often stop a group and do a little something in order to bring more relaxation in, and then we'll start working again. So we might be saying all the right things, but we remain fundamentally guarded. And to cope with the stress, we often will resort to domination or trying to convince others we're right. We seek protection in small coalitions. We collapse into kind of us versus them. And these are all just, a lot of this is just simply the response of being in the grip of our defensive system. We also withdraw because the stress hormones demand it. And in all these ways, the body's defensive system is actually ruling the day. So learning about this is extremely important. We're learning about embodiment and how to work with trauma. And we also have to learn how to work with conflict, because conflict is an embodied experience. And I would say that the greatest weakness in my work with mediators is that we just stay so focused on the content and the issues, and we fail to deal with what's actually happening in our nervous systems and in the group of people that we're working with. And as I said, after we do a little meditative work, then I'll talk a little bit about the most powerful communication skill that we can use in order to bring about more sameness. So what I would like to do is to take you through a little bit of a guided meditation. And basically, I'm just going to introduce you to the 4 different instructions that I use to calibrate my nervous system. Now, what people use as their technique is variable. And I want you to understand that the 4 that I use tend to come, believe it or not, directly out of my meditation experience. So I'll describe those to you in just a moment. Just going to take a little bit of a breath. And I'm going to invite you to go ahead and sit up, or find, if you will, at least your sits bones under you. If you wouldn't mind just feeling your pelvis and where you're making contact with gravity. And to begin, what I would like to invite you to do is to think, if you can, about the last time that you were having a difference. Could be minor, could be a little more significant, with someone that you're close to in the interpersonal domain, where you felt your nervous system activated. And remember that, and see what kinds of sensations you can simply call up and what it felt like in your body. It might be interesting to notice the kind of thoughts that you were having and how those were expressed in your speech, what the quality of those thoughts were. It could be important to notice what sensations you actually felt in your body. Could you feel tension? Could you feel excitement? Did any of the sensations of feeling gripped, either in your neck or in your limbs, your hands? Do you remember tightening in your jaw? Do you remember a sensation of wanting to get away from the difference? Just some kind of a sense of looking around for an exit. Was that part of your experience? Did you find yourself maybe compulsively agreeing with the person that you might have had the difference with? Did you find yourself just kind of smoothing it over so you could get past it? Keep in mind that all these are intelligent responses to this excitement in the nervous system. But one of the things that I like to teach is that by learning how to regulate our own body, we can stay present to the difference. We can overcome the sensations of threat. And we can explore and learn from the difference. So allow yourself just to feel the totality of that experience. And now I'm going to share with you the 4 cues that I use to self-regulate when the encounter with difference is setting me off. So see if you can do these with me. The first thing that I do when I feel that arousal, if you will, or that triggering, is to remind myself mentally and cognitively that everything is okay. The sensations that I'm starting to feel are telling me that I'm unsafe or that things could go awry, but in fact, my ability to simply be present to my body is a gesture in the direction of being able to work with this. So things are okay. A cognitive cue. Doesn't feel that way, but it is. Now I'm imagining a scenario in which I'm exploring a difference with a friend or with a colleague. And so I'm imagining there's some conversation happening. But the next thing that I want to do is I'm just going to feel the weight of my body. So the first cue is cognitive. The second cue is embodied. I'm going to feel every place in my body where I can sense gravity. I can feel it in the base of my body, my sits bones, and my pelvis. I can feel gravity across the base of my feet and my thighs as I'm sitting on the couch. I can feel the weight and the density, and that very sensation of density is helping my mind to slow down and to relax. I can feel the earth. I can feel stability. And I can feel that the movement the sensations are causing is actually balanced by this sense of density and stillness. Just sense that. How can you feel gravity and the stability of your own body? When we sit in meditation, what we usually do first is establish the posture. So this is a moment of relating with our posture and with our body. The third cue that I like to use is the reliable identifying with the breath. The body is dense, and the mind is etheric, and the breath harmonizes body and mind. So tuning into the rhythm of the breath, the natural inhalation, and the experience of the exhalation like a relieving sigh, a little bit longer than the inhalation. And we know that probably the most efficient cue for regulating, for self-regulation, is working with the breath. But personally, I find when I've established some attention in the density of my body, I find working with the breath a little bit easier. Allowing for the inhalation, simply lengthening the out breath. And my final cue also comes from meditative practice, and that is to notice the mind and the agitation of my thoughts, and to just see if I can feel something like space in my mind, in the mind, and in the room, so that I'm experiencing space both on the inside or the interior of my experience and the exterior of my experience. And as I feel my body and my breath and space, then suddenly, whatever this difference is, whatever its importance to me and my people, that there's room for it. There's room for it to be explored. There's room for its legitimacy. There can be an interest in how activating it is. And most importantly, when we turn towards the difference and open to it, that creative tension is almost inevitably filled with a kind of learning. There are things for us to learn when we're able to sustain and explore our differences. And we need to know our bodies in order to be able to do it. As I said when I began my talk, that our differences are always, always connected to our fundamental commonality. In fact, having conflict and differing is one of the most intimate things we can do. Learning how to work with our differences and how to engage them in a way that's productive, creative, life-giving, so that it deepens our trust in one another, our risk-taking, and our ability to be creative is a really, really important skill. It's a different conversation how we take all this to scale. But if you can practice this in your interpersonal life, it will really go a long way, is my belief. So if you would please open your eyes, and I'll say just a few more things, and then we'll open it up for questions. There are two things that would be super helpful for you to understand. And that is that in the domain of communication, listening skills soothe the nervous system. So anytime there's activation in your family life or with others, and what you really would like to be able to do is to soothe the system and to calibrate and regulate and create coherence in what's happening, all you have to do is bring out your listening skills. You know, it's become kind of a terrible cliche, but so what I hear you saying is, as soon as we make that gesture to listen and to reflect what we heard someone else to say, we're literally becoming the same. They feel it, we feel it, and in that, the relaxation sets in and everybody can begin to kind of calm down. So as a mediator, of course, really learning how to listen to what people's wants and needs are, what they're afraid of, give them the experience that you understand, that it matters, that it's legitimate, everybody begins to relax. I used to be a horse trainer when I was a young woman, and we used to call that in horse training, turning loose. That when the horse quit being different from the trainer and that you're able to join and start working together, that was when the horse relaxed and turned loose. And the same is true of people. That when we use our listening skills, other people will relax, they'll let down, then they can start to access their creativity. They can start to think together again. A lot of this is highly, highly physiological. So that's one of the important points. So listening, like meditation, is golden. And it has some of the same qualities of meditation, meaning that when we really genuinely want to hear what someone else has to say, we have to, for a moment, set aside our own thoughts. We have to let our own thoughts go. We become present in the moment and we become receptive, right? We're just right here, right now, receiving, feeling, and absorbing what's being said. Never, ever confuse listening with agreement. They're not the same. We make the mistake of thinking that if I give someone the experience they've been heard, they're automatically going to think I agree. And it's not the case, right? You can give someone a very profound experience of hearing them out without agreeing at all with what it is they're saying. And it's important to make that distinction. Let me make sure I understand what you're saying. I'm not sure if I agree, but let me just see if I understand and correct me, if you will. Help me out. So one of the challenges that people often have is they have the experience that they're willing to listen and someone else isn't. And my advice to you is that when you really do a good job of hearing what someone else has to say, without mixing it up with your preferences or your opinions, and reflecting some of the feeling and some of the concerns that you're hearing, and then you want to be heard, my advice would be to simply ask, would you be willing to reflect what you heard me say? Like, let's get on the same page together. So listening is the golden communication skill for soothing the room, for bringing your own nervous system and other people's nervous systems into coherence. So you can do it with your own through the 4 cues, but you can do it with others through being willing to reflectively listen. In order to grow, we have to be willing to encounter difference. And the way that we create that energetic tension is really to express our first person. You know, so listening is becoming the same, expressing our difference is becoming different. And sometimes what we need in relationship and in groups is to actually bring our differences out so that we can increase the energy and the excitement and the life force in the body and the sense that something exciting and dangerous is happening. And then everybody kind of wakes up and it's like, oh, this is worthwhile. And the way we do that is by simply expressing in the best way we know how our own first person experience. Every time we do that, it's exciting to a space to hear, to be willing to express what you really think and feel. And I'd like to point this out to you so that you can look at it and study it if you want to. In Martin Luther King's very iconic I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King, there are 3 waves to his speech. In the first wave, he's addressing America, and he's basically with a sense of justice and righteousness, that America has really not paid its debt to its Black people after the Civil War in the wake of Jim Crow, and that debt has come due, and it's time for America to make good on that, on what has been owed. And it's a third person challenge to America itself. So it's a third person. And then he transitions from talking about America and the debt that's owed to talking about us and you. So he moves into a second person of us in the civil rights movement. It's plural you, you know. And he basically says, in order for us to maintain the moral high ground, the way that we do this demands the highest level of ethics and the highest level of human dignity that we can possibly bring to this fight and bring to this moment in history. And so he's invoking he's invoking us, and he's saying that this is something we need to do. And my understanding is at this point, the speech is fine, but the gospel singer Mahalia Jackson is on the front row, and she's a good friend of his. And for whatever reason, she says to him, tell them about your dream, Martin. Tell them about your dream. So he forgets about America, and he forgets how he's extolling the civil rights movement. He puts his notes down and he begins to speak from his own first person. And when he speaks from his own first person, he connects not only to what is true for him, but also to his life force and his energy. And when he connects to his own message, his own first person experience, suddenly there's so much life force moving through his body that's the point at which the speech becomes iconic. And so what I want to say to you is that the privilege of being able to use all these different perspectives, but to ground our communications often in a very direct first person, is very exciting to our system. It's very moving, and it creates connection, it creates intimacy, and it gives us the opportunity to really express our energy, our care, and our compassion. It can be very, very moving. So listening, we become the same. Expressing ourselves, we have an opportunity to express our difference. And when we really connect to truth and to ourselves, it's interesting how other people will also want to become the same. So these are really, really powerful tools that you can use in your life, in your work. They're very embodied. They have tremendous impact. But I think as a collective, we're just beginning to scratch the surface of this understanding so that we can really start to use what we know about the body and about the brain and about our defensiveness in a way that can begin to really benefit us. So my hope is that just by spending this time with me, that you've contemplated this idea and that you've seen the value of deepening our sameness, and that you're also excited about the prospect of being able to work with our differences and our conflicts in a way that is much more generative than we're used to. So thank you, everybody, for listening and for taking that journey with me. I'd love to turn it over to Dr. Rich and see if there are any questions that we'd like to listen for.
Yes, Diane. Yes, we have several. And The first question has to do with the first cue, an anchor, and the statement of things are okay. And the question has to do with someone who throughout their childhood was invalidated repeatedly for their body truth when they felt a certain sensation that something was unhealthy, unsafe, and
not okay.
Not okay, and they masked it and repressed it. So in your instruction and offering, could you unpack that element of what is okay when you know certain things are not okay, and make that differentiation where you can hold both?
Very good. So the word differentiation is really important right there, because setting boundaries, setting limits, being able to trust ourselves in terms of what we assess as dangerous is really, really important. It's an example of difference and how difference can become extremely life-giving when we use it skillfully. So what I would say to the person asking the question is that in your earlier life experience, someone else's perceptions were dominating yours. And in this time, in this life experience, your task, of course, in healing is to start to really trust your own perceptions. So for you, you really do have to ask the question, is this safe? Is this? And can I assess the safety of it? And if it isn't, then listen to those sensations and take cover. But if your assessment is actually, no, this is a safe environment, this is a good context for me to practice this in, I can deal with all the intelligence of my body asking me to look out, and using my rationality and my senses, and my instincts, I can ascertain that in fact, right now is actually a really good time for me to counterintuitively move away from those sensations. So my suggestion is I just want to give you a lot of self-empowerment to trust yourself and to use your own intelligence to assess whether it's genuinely safe or isn't.
And would that process be something to practice with a teacher in simulation to develop the confidence to be able to mute those old habits of subordination to another person's voice?
I think that there are probably a number of different contexts that could be super helpful. I mean, definitely working with a teacher who is, trained in embodiment and sensation, and paying attention to the patterns of trauma and to how one heals, and also one continues to grow and develop, because there's healing work and there's just the natural process of learning. So a context with a teacher, I think, is a great one. I think good friends can be a context. I think anybody who you trust their assessment, so you can check your assessment out with theirs, is a great person to practice with.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then in your work as a mediator, you mentioned that you had observed there was not the embodied experience and acknowledgement. Did you bring that into your work as a mediator? And could you tell us a little bit about what that looked like and if it happened?
Yes. Well, I used to think that I was just a highly sensitive person, because whenever I worked with people, I had really strong embodied experiences of threat and anxiety and nausea. And, I was just constantly working to calm myself. And then, for some crazy reason, it occurred to me to realize they're actually equally as sensitive, and they're feeling all the same things I'm feeling. And now I need to use those feelings as an indication of how people are actually doing. And when those feelings in me are out of whack, I need to be able to calibrate, to relax, to become, to soothe the system. And I need to be able to support others in also being soothed. And so I feel like I I don't know. I think it's a kind of a co-arising. I think the emphasis on embodiment and the awareness of the body kind of arose in me as well, where it just started to become important to me to pay attention to my own body maybe it was because I was doing meditation, you know, I'm a child of the 70s, you know, therapeutic work I did, and, you know, massage and whatnot. So just all this coming into fuller awareness of who we are as human beings, I participated in that. And then now it's just absolutely the thing I pay the most attention to is what's happening in our bodies when I'm working with the conflict.
And it sounds like you're moderating and being mindful to this. Do you articulate it and bring conscious awareness for the people you're working with?
Absolutely. Absolutely, I do. So sometimes I'll say, whoa, I'm getting freaked out. Everybody, I don't know how you're doing, but I need just a minute to bring it down for a second, you know? So I'll kind of do it myself, or else I'll say, hey, let's just for just a minute, everybody, let's just take a moment to feel. And I'm talking about now the presence of a kind of emotion. Let's say the expression of hurt or sorrow arises. Let's feel together for just a minute, everybody. That was powerful. I don't want to gloss over that. I notice my heart wants to give a little additional attention to that. Or would you be willing to reflect what you heard her say? It sounds like she really cares about that. And I think it would be good for me and maybe for all of us if I could just ask you to repeat some of what you felt like you heard her say. Or what did you happen to hear, you know, anyone say? So I'm doing it in different ways all the time. I'm just bringing the awareness of the body into the experience. And sometimes through modeling, sometimes through asking people to listen, sometimes through silence and feeling, sometimes through breaking into small groups and letting people just, you know, express some of the anxiety and the fear, kind of get that off the surface. So I'm much more engaged now in embodiment type practices when I mediate than I used to be.
Thank you for that work and for describing it. I'll move to another question. It says, I appreciate the guidance at this important level of personal experience. I am curious about scaling. It feels to me that this is where collectively, where we are, and not just in the US, but in many locations around the world. What is your viewpoint on how to broadly share your insights?
You know, it's a question that I really appreciate because I feel like it's something that I'm living with all the time, is the question of scale. Because it's the work that I do as a Zen teacher, as a professional mediator in smaller groups, in larger groups, the training that I do, the transformational training, you know, that's not creating a tipping point. It's a very important question, and I think that in a certain way, we have to develop a little bit more as a collective kind of sophistication that runs the range from, you know, how we deal with weaponry. You know, as we know in this country, we can't even deal with weaponry very well, and how we create protection, you know, all the way to how do we evolve our consciousness to really create more compassion, more love, more understanding for people who appear to have a different set of values, a different way of being. And those values can often feel threatening to me. So I'm imagining the people that are working on global peace studies. One of my co-authors actually studied peace studies at Columbia, and she did some research at the UN. So she has a better sense of things at scale than I do, because that's a little bit more her expertise. But I think it's just growing in our sophistication about all the different dimensions, from the most subtle to the most gross. And how do we put what we need to put in place in order to protect all of us so that we can experience the peace and the joy that's available to us being a human being. But it's a big endeavor, and I want your questioner to know I take that question seriously, and I don't have good answers. It's not really where I've put a lot of my time, but I think about it a lot.
Thank you. Next question is, when you are in a situation with the discriminatory communication that is personal, how do you separate or process speaking out and feeling a burden for the other person's unawareness, where they're not seeing the damage? Do we self-protect, say nothing? How do you navigate that situation?
Well, I think the most important thing in every moment is to be clear about one's intention. And if one's intention is to basically serve as, to use each moment as an opportunity for us to become more wakeful together and more compassionate together, that intention by itself will help you make that decision. How is it that I'm going to work with this in this particular moment? I personally like to believe that we're all growing together. So one of the things I want to do is be able to receive from others moments when they bring out my unawareness. So if I say something that is got a bias in it, a hidden bias that I just don't see, I want to be able to be open to hearing somebody, bring that to my attention. I want to be able to be open to a way in which my being white is preventing me from seeing the way a person of color would experience something I just said. So starting with myself. So first it's intentionality. Secondly, what is my own unawareness like? And then thirdly, what is going to serve in this moment? And I think in that moment, you have a lot of freedom. You can be really challenging and say, hey, that wasn't okay. Here's the implications of what you said. It hurts. And I want to ask you to stop, to tell me again what you mean. It's kind of, I'm not quite able to hear that. Would you mind telling me more? What exactly are you thinking? I'm imagining you saying something different than that. So tell me more about it. And then I'll ask a little bit more. You can create a deeper conversation in which you build rapport through the conversation, and you can put your foot down. You have all kinds of choices in between. And I think they're all available. What I teach my students is whatever choice you choose to make, your only obligation is to pay attention to the impact. And did it create the outcome you wanted? And if it did, feel free to be yourself. One of my meditation teachers used to say, be yourself, the world will give you feedback. So if your intervention created the response you were wanting, great. If it didn't, keep experimenting. Just stay connected to the impact of what you do.
Thank you. In using the 4 steps you offered us, speak to how one can create the space in a moment, like the example in the last question, to call that in. And do you use some pause invitation phrase such as bear with me, or I'm going to take a moment so you tell the other people that you are going to go through those 4 steps, or how do you actually carve out time?
I don't. I know some people do. They ask for a pause. I just let people talk. Usually I just kind of become a little bit quiet and let them say what they're saying. And I'm usually a little bit half listening. And I'm mostly just telling myself, just stay present. Just be present. We don't have to engage the content yet. I'm going to work with my own body. I'm going to do my best to listen a little bit. When the time's right, I'm going to reflect what I'm hearing. And then I'm going to ask if the other person will be willing to listen to me a little bit. So I know people create that break and that pause. I was actually in a workshop this last week, and there was some really dicey stuff that went on in the workshop. And as the facilitator, there was a moment where you could say that I lost my seat. Like the group was no longer following me. Let me put it that way. So I was no longer the leader of what we were doing. And that's a hard moment to be present to when one is wanting to do a good job and be seen as, competent. And then suddenly you feel like you're not. And there was a moment where a woman said, I think we should really give Diane a moment to leave the room and, be with herself for a minute. And I turned to her and I said, I really appreciate you taking care of me in that way. But what I really want to do right now is stay as present as I can to what my experience is and to what's happening for you. And I feel like if I do that, I and us will find our way through this. And what I don't really feel like I need to do is leave. So, that's not to say you can't, but it's just, maybe I've just done it for so long that I don't need the break. You can always ask for a break if you need one.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Another question asks about applying this work in experiencing difference in a marriage.
Yeah.
And could you maybe illuminate how
It'll cost you extra. Everything applies. I mean, one of the things about marriages I think that are challenging is that we tend to, within the first couple of years, develop coping strategies for dealing with our differences. And so one of the things that becomes challenging is how we actually interrupt our pattern of coping in order to become more present to one another. So my advice would be to simply say, I just want us to learn, how to really hear each other out. When we have differences or disagreements, see if we can do a better job. Of course, then, you could get in trouble because your spouse might say, I don't want to do that with you. But imagining that they're open to it, then you can just immediately start to practice using your reflective listening skills. And if they're irritated because you sound like a psychotherapist, just say to them, I'm practicing, cut me some slack. I really want to just repeat what I heard you say. Everything in my body right now is freaking out, but I am just going to hear that, whatever it happens to be. And thank you for allowing me to be present with you. So we can set a tone that we're going to disrupt our own patterns and learn and use these skills. And I promise you, everybody, it will benefit all of your relationships. It sounds kind of corny, but like I say, we tend to take our commonalities for granted and we don't use the skills that are available to us to deepen them. So not only working with difference, but also deepening our sense that we're one and the same.
So another question on the theme you were just on says, in addition to maybe language and biology, what creates sameness and difference? And then a second follow-on question, can perceiving sameness and difference be a barrier to deep understanding?
Your questions, everybody, they're profound, I'm having to dig deep. So I think that the first answer to the question of what creates sameness and difference is, what is the source of all things? And I don't really know the answer to that, but I'm compelled and love the question. What I do know is the story that we tell about the evolution of the universe, that there's just this incredible dance of sameness and difference that goes on, in the sense that at first there's nothing and everything's the same. And then there's the appearance of some material, or some pattern, something they might call a quark. And all there are quarks and nothingness. And then those quarks hang around together for, I don't know, millions of years. And suddenly they coalesce and there's an atom. And then those atoms hang around being atoms. And then they coalesce and boom, all of a sudden they're molecules and their complexity. And then all of a sudden we're off to the races. The universe is coming into form, and it is just this dance of the same, and that they create what one writer calls the creative advance into novelty. Difference is the creative advance into novelty, and our universe seems to work like that. Where it comes from, I really have no idea, but it's astounding when you contemplate it. Can one be stuck in contemplating it and fail to simply be present to all that is? I think so. Yeah, I think so.
Thank you. Then the question arose of, where did you find the spark of difference to pull you into your pursuits of mediation and meditation? And what is your dream?
Oh my gosh, how beautiful. Thank you so much for that question. Well, there were kind of two dimensions to it. One was that I grew up in the American West. I'm an American cowgirl, you might say. I grew up riding horses a lot in the mountains, which contributed to my love of silence and expansiveness and stillness. And at the same time, I had a very dynamic family. There were 5 kids and my folks, and everybody had a personality that was larger than life. And while that was stimulating and fun and exciting, as a child, one of my experiences was just how painful our differences were. That for whatever reason, as soon as differences emerged and they were energized and we started to either argue or fight or whatever, there was just no way out of it. And so I think as a young person, I watched that and always imagined there could be a different outcome. That there seemed to be, from where I was sitting, a truth here and there was a truth there. And those truths didn't really seem to be able to talk to each other. And in my work with Ken Wilber, one of the things that he says is that every perspective is true and partial. And that, having that kind of instinct that was the case, but being deeply frustrated by the inability for my family to make any kind of creative use out of our differences was really painful. So in a way, like a lot of people, I think one of my dreams was kind of to rectify some of the pain of my own upbringing, the unresolved questions in my heart. And that's what drew me to mediation. At the same time, I also had the experience when I was 17 years old of losing 4 of my friends who died in a light plane, in a plane accident. I had another friend who died in an automobile, another one who, believe it or not, was killed in a murder, terrible situation, and another one who committed suicide. So that was very strange. That happened in a 2-month period that I lost 7 friends in very, very different ways. And that just changed me. I really developed a very deep thirst and longing to understand what is meaningful in this life, given the fact that we die. I was very affected by those losses and wanted to spend my time wanting to spend my time as a human being in some way that had meaning or had value, because I experienced death in such a dramatic fashion when I was young. And that's really what started my spiritual search. And so those two, I kind of went for philosophy and Zen training early, but found, as I said before, I'm a talented mediator with not very much training, and I'm a deeply untalented meditator, but I have a lot of training. So I started working as a mediator because it just came very naturally to me, and I seem to have an instinct for how to do it when I was in my early 30s, and then I was hired by the Utah State Court system and that's when I became involved in racial and ethnic fairness initiatives that we were doing 20 years ago. And, just a lot of different kind of work and conversation happened when I was working in the mediation world. So thank you for that question about my dream. Whoever asked that was very tender. Appreciate that.
And building upon your answer, there's a question about how sameness and difference may transform into each other. And you've touched on that. And would you like to say more about how they are in a flow state with each other?
Absolutely. I mean, it's absolutely the case that they're utterly inextricable. Utterly inextricable. Difference, sameness, you can experience sameness in the domain of timelessness. Difference is always arising in a more within the domain of mind that is more time bound. So, the Buddha's awakening was to a dimension that is not bound by time. Evolution is utterly time bound. What there is without time, there's no evolution. So the differences arise because of time in a way. I'll give you an example, and this is cool. And this is something that happens when we mediate. and we see that the differences are an expression of the sameness and that they're not separate, sometimes what happens is we see the polarities flip. So last couple of weeks ago, I was working in a training, and the people in the training had a very profound intention. They wanted to study facilitator skills. They wanted to become more intimate with themselves to enhance their facilitator skills. And they wanted to practice, particularly being sensitive to issues related to our differences, so that the BIPOC members of the group felt an utter sense of belonging. So they had a big agenda and a good agenda. So we worked together for 5 days in lots of different ways. And just as we were closing, we were revisiting the intention. And I proposed the question to a Black woman who was in the group, well, actually, no, to the entire group, if you would like to share what the experience has been in terms of, our inclusion principles, feel free to share that as part of your check-in. And it was just as we were ending, it wasn't a check-in, it was a close. And a couple of people did, and a few other people did, and it was going fine. And then a particular woman said, you can't ask people of color in the last 10 minutes of a 5-day retreat how they're doing. There just simply isn't enough time. And I had great rapport with everybody in this group. And I said to this woman, I said, that makes total sense to me. Would you be interested in hearing what I was intending? Is that something you'd be open to, just hearing what I was intending? And she said, for sure. And so then as I started to tell her what I was intending, this kind of crazy, awesome thing happened where I suddenly felt like I didn't have enough time. And so I said to her, this is funny because suddenly I feel like I don't have enough time. So now I feel completely the same as you. I think you're absolutely right. Let's throw this thing out. We'll revisit it later when we do have enough time. And it was just this nice moment of a difference flipping and us becoming the same. So that's an example of how everything's the same, everything's different.
Wonderful example. Thank you so much for sharing it. Let me just see if there is another question that came in. It says, how do you see the role of new and emerging technologies in interacting with / influencing our sense of sameness and or difference?
I think I also like the person who was saying, how do we scale, how do we scale what we're learning about creating safety and sameness? That is a koan. That's a question that has to be lived. And I would say the same thing about this one. I think technology has a role to play. I don't know what technologies are out there, particularly to help with this at this point. I mean, I do know in my work that we use all kinds of technologies for bringing groups of people to agreement, using polling and voting and different kinds of technologies. But I'm sure that there's a big area like that. The one thing I will say is that I do feel that if there is a way to, program, you could say, kind of ethical conduct into our tech, I think that would be really important. And I think that to imagine that, the machines and the tech that we're generating, that it needs to be infused with compassion and with equanimity and with all the things that we value. So I feel like our value set needs to be part of this evolving technology. And that's all I can really say on that topic, because I don't know enough to say much else.
Thank you. It ties to Fleet Mull's contribution to the summit, where the ethical component is always a cornerstone that will support everything. So thank you for naming that. Diane, we thank you for all that you're doing in the world and how beautifully you shared your work with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me again.